For 37 years, Sister Evangeline was known all over St. Augustine Parish, Louisiana, as a perfect example of religious devotion. She taught about purity and goodness to the wives of plantation owners. She gave lessons to young women about staying pure and doing the right thing. People thought she was like a living saint. Her reputation was so perfect that local families even sent their most difficult enslaved women to her convent. They believed that prayer and religious training under Sister Evangeline's watchful care could clean their souls. But in the spring of 1858, a fire burned through the convent and turned most of it into ash. When authorities finally went into the cellar, a place Sister Evangeline had always forbidden anyone to enter, they discovered something that would disappear from every official church record within 48 hours. What they found wasn't a place of prayer. Instead, they found evidence of something else entirely. It was an operation that had been producing children, dozens of them, using methods that made her sermons about purity sound like the cruelest joke ever preached. The church sealed the investigation almost immediately. The surviving nuns were scattered to distant parishes. But a few burned account ledgers escaped destruction. Those ledgers reveal in chilling detail what Sister Evangeline had really been doing in that cellar each night. Before we continue with the story of Sister Evangeline and the horror that burned beneath her convent, I need you to do one thing. If you're hearing this for the first time, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the hidden histories we uncover. And tell me in the comments below, where are you listening from? I want to see where our community of truth seekers is growing. Now, let's discover what Sister Evangeline was really doing. What makes this case especially disturbing is how big her lies were and how perfectly they were hidden behind religious authority. The town of St. Augustine Parish, Louisiana in 1821 had fewer than 800 people scattered across plantation land and muddy crossroads. The Mississippi River controlled everything: commerce, weather, and survival itself. Cotton was king, and everyone knew their place in its kingdom. The parish church, St. Dominic's, served both the landed families and their enslaved people, though rarely at the same service. Father Benedict Russo, who had led this church since 1803, was growing old. His letters to the diocese in New Orleans spoke frequently about his declining health and his concern for the spiritual welfare of the unfortunate people held in slavery throughout his parish. When the Sisters of Divine Mercy arrived that April, they seemed like an answer to prayers no one had dared to voice. The order was small and not well known. It was led by a woman who had taken the name Sister Evangeline when she took her vows. She was perhaps 40 years old, though her behavior suggested someone who had lived harder than her years. She spoke French with a Haitian accent and English with careful precision. She conducted herself with the absolute certainty of someone who had found her calling. With her came 3 other sisters, Sister Marie, Sister Constance, and Sister Beatrice. Each was younger and each showed more respect to Evangeline's authority. The Delmare family, one of the parish's wealthiest plantation owners, donated the land for the convent. The property sat 2 miles from town. It could only be reached by a single road that became impossible mud during heavy rains. It consisted of 40 acres of partially cleared land, a large house in considerable disrepair, and several outbuildings that had once been used as storage for a failed tobacco venture. Charles Delmare explained his generosity in a letter preserved at the Parish Historical Society. It is our Christian duty to support those who minister to the souls of all God's children, particularly those held in bondage who require moral instruction and the comfort of religion. What Delmare didn't mention in his letter was the specific arrangement he made with Sister Evangeline. The convent would accept enslaved women purchased or donated by parish families for spiritual rehabilitation and moral education. These women, Evangeline explained, had proven particularly difficult or rebellious, or had committed offenses that made them unsuitable for plantation labor. The convent would reform them through prayer work and religious instruction. The arrangement seemed to benefit everyone. Planters could remove troublesome property without the loss of selling them south. The church could demonstrate its commitment to the spiritual welfare of enslaved souls, and the convent would have a self-sustaining labor force to work their land. By the summer of 1821, 7 women had been transferred to the Sisters of Divine Mercy. Their names appear in a single entry in the Delmare estate records: Patience, Ruth, Adeline, Mercy, Hannah, Rebecca, and Grace. Ages ranged from 16 to 32. The notation beside each name simply read, "To Convent for Reform, the convent's daily routine." As Sister Evangeline described it to Father Russo during his occasional visits, followed strict religious order. The women rose before dawn, attended morning prayers, worked the fields and gardens, received religious instruction in the afternoon, and retired after evening vespers. Sister Evangeline reported steady progress in their spiritual development. She spoke of rebellious natures gradually softened by prayer, of women learning humility and acceptance of their lot as God's will. Father Russo in his letters expressed satisfaction with the arrangement. What he never saw, what no one saw, was what happened after dark. The convent's main building had been constructed in the 1790s by a French merchant who had arrived with grand ambitions and died bankrupt. The house followed a design common to Louisiana, raised on brick piers to avoid flood damage, with a wide gallery wrapping around the ground floor and living quarters on the upper level. But it also had something unusual for the region, a full cellar. It was supposedly built by the merchant for storing wines and goods that required cool temperatures. The cellar extended beneath the entire house. It was accessible only by a trap door in what had been the merchant's office and was now Sister Evangeline's private chamber. By October of 1821, 6 months after the convent's establishment, something had shifted in the atmosphere of St. Augustine Parish. It was nothing anyone could quite name, but plantation owners began noting it in their journals and letters. Enslaved populations that had been restless now seemed subdued. Several planned escape attempts whispered about in the quarters never happened. Women who had been defiant now kept their eyes downward and their voices low. Meanwhile, the convent remained curiously isolated. Sister Evangeline discouraged visitors, citing the importance of maintaining an atmosphere of contemplation. Father Russo's monthly visits became the only regular contact between the sisters and the outside world. Even these were conducted in the formal parlor, with tea and religious discussion. The women being reformed were never present during these visits. They are in a state of spiritual discipline. Sister Evangeline would explain, or must not be distracted from their prayers and labor. The account ledgers, however, told a different story. These books, maintained in Sister Evangeline's precise hand, recorded every transaction, every acquisition, every birth, every death. But they were written in a code so subtle that they appeared entirely innocent until you understood what you were reading. The first entry that should have raised questions appeared in November 1821, just 7 months after the convent's establishment. It read simply, "Delivered of a male child, 7th day, Mother Adeline. Baptism performed by Sister E. Father recorded as unknown. Child placed according to arrangement with C.D. Within 3 weeks, a similar entry delivered of a female child, 12th day, Mother Ruth. Father recorded as unknown. Child placed according to arrangement with H.B. The initials C.D. and H.B. corresponded to Charles Delmare and Henry Beaumont, 2 of the parish's most prominent planters. The phrase, placed according to arrangement, appeared again and again in the ledgers over the following months. By the end of 1822, 9 children had been born at the convent and placed according to arrangement. What made these entries remarkable wasn't merely their existence. Enslaved women giving birth was hardly unusual in the antebellum South. What was remarkable was the timing. Every woman brought to the convent had arrived in the spring and summer of 1821. They could not have been pregnant upon arrival, or it would have been noted. Yet by November, births were occurring. The math was impossible to ignore, but only if you were looking for it. In January 1823, the convent received a new resident. Her name was Sarah, and she had been part of the Delmare household for 8 years, since childhood. The entry in Delmare's estate records read, Sarah, aged 19, to convent for moral reformation following incidents of willful disobedience and attempted corruption of other property. The phrase, attempted corruption, had a specific meaning in the parish. It meant she had been teaching others to read, a crime in Louisiana since 1806. Sarah's arrival changed something fundamental in the convent's hidden operation. Unlike the other women, she had been educated by the Delmare daughter before the law forbade it. She understood the power of documentation. Within weeks of her arrival, she began noticing patterns. She observed Sister Evangeline's movements, the visitors who came only after dark, the sounds that came from the cellar at night. The cellar itself was a peculiar space. During daylight hours, it served as cool storage for the convent's food supplies and the herbs Sister Evangeline used in her medicines. But it had been modified since the convent's establishment. The original space had been divided into several smaller rooms, each with a heavy wooden door that could be barred from the outside. These rooms, Sister Evangeline explained when questioned, were necessary for women in the deepest throes of spiritual crisis, requiring separation from others for their own protection and the safety of the community. By March 1823, Sarah had been at the convent for 2 months. In a letter she managed to smuggle out through a visiting priest's luggage, a letter that would surface decades later. She described what she had learned. The sisters do not take vows of poverty, nor do they live as servants of God. Sister E conducts a business, and we are the merchandise. Men come after dark, wealthy men from the town and surrounding parishes, men whose faces I would recognize if I saw them in daylight. They arrive in unmarked carriages. They pay Sister E in gold and silver, which she records in her ledgers. Then they are taken downstairs. The letter continued with careful, damning detail. Each of us is kept in the cellar rooms. When our time comes, Sister E calculates it by the moon and by her careful records of when each woman last blood. When she determines the time is optimal, the arrangements are made. The men who come are those who wish for children but whose wives cannot provide them, or who wish for children who can be sold for profit, but cannot risk the scandal of their association. Sister E provides the solution. She makes the matches according to the complexion and features she believes will produce the most valuable offspring. Sarah's letter never reached its intended destination. The priest who unknowingly carried it, Father Michel Arnaud from New Orleans, stopped at the convent on his return journey. Sister Evangeline served him dinner and pressed him to stay the night due to the threatening weather. He accepted. By morning, Father Arnaud was dead. Sister Evangeline reported to the diocese that he had suffered a stroke during the night. His belongings were returned to New Orleans with a note of condolence. The letter was not among them. The years from 1823 to 1835 saw the convent's operation reach its horrifying efficiency. The ledgers from this period, which eventually came to light through a series of accidents and inheritances, reveal a system operating with the precision of any other business enterprise in the antebellum South. Sister Evangeline had created something unique, a breeding operation disguised as a religious mission, protected by the sanctity of the church and the isolation of the convent's location. The entries became more detailed and more clinical. Each woman had a page dedicated to her productivity. Physical characteristics were noted: height, complexion, hair texture, facial features. Medical observations included monthly cycles tracked with meticulous care, previous births and their outcomes, any complications or difficulties. The men who visited were identified only by initials, but cross-referencing with payment records and later estate documents revealed their identities: plantation owners, merchants, even 2 parish judges. The children born in the convent followed specific paths determined before their birth. Some were returned to the estates of the men who had paid for their conception, recorded in those estates' registers as having been born to enslaved women already owned. Others were sold privately, bringing significant sums that Sister Evangeline divided between the convent's accounts and payments to the men who had provided the service. The most valuable children, those with the lightest complexions and the most European features, commanded the highest prices. Sometimes they disappeared into households in New Orleans or even farther north, passing into lives where their origins would never be questioned. The convent expanded during these years. 2 additional buildings were constructed, officially recorded as dormitories for the growing number of women seeking spiritual refuge. In reality, they provided separate housing for women in different stages of Sister Evangeline's system: those currently pregnant, those recovering from childbirth, and those being prepared for the next cycle. Sister Evangeline herself transformed from an obscure nun into a woman of considerable, if quiet, influence. Her donations to St. Dominic's Church increased each year. She funded repairs to the building, purchased new vestments for Father Russo, and provided a generous stipend for the parish's educational efforts, limited, of course, to white children. Father Russo praised her charitable works in his correspondence with the diocese, never questioning the source of her wealth. But some people noticed what was hidden in plain sight. Estate managers began remarking on the number of light-skinned children being born to enslaved women who had spent time at the convent. Wives whispered about husbands who took business trips to St. Augustine Parish with suspicious frequency. And the enslaved communities developed their own folklore about the convent's stories passed in whispers, warnings given to young women, prayers offered that they would never be deemed in need of reformation. In 1835 a new figure entered the story. His name was Benjamin Trask, and he was neither planter nor priest, but something more dangerous: a newspaper editor. Trask had purchased the struggling St. Augustine Parish Gazette and intended to transform it into a publication of substance. He was from Philadelphia originally, carried abolitionist sympathies he was intelligent enough to keep mostly hidden, and possessed a reporter's instinct for stories that didn't quite fit together properly. Trask first took note of the convent while researching a series of articles on the parish's history. He noticed the absence of certain records: baptisms that should have been filed with the church, births that seemed to appear in estate registers without corresponding pregnancy observations in overseers' journals. He began asking questions, carefully and indirectly, interviewing longtime residents about the parish's charitable institutions. One conversation proved particularly illuminating. Judith Crenshaw, a 72-year-old widow who had lived in the parish since 1799, received Trask in her parlor one October afternoon. After an hour of discussing the parish's early settlement, she grew quiet, then said something that would change the trajectory of Trask's investigation. "You're asking about the convent. I wondered when someone would. My dear boy, there are some things in this parish we don't speak of, and that place is foremost among them. But if you want to understand what really happens there, don't talk to the planters or the priests. Talk to the midwives." The midwives of St. Augustine Parish occupied a unique position in the antebellum South's social structure. They moved between the worlds of white and black, wealthy and enslaved, birth and death. They saw things others didn't, knew secrets that never appeared in official records, and maintained a code of silence that protected their ability to practice their essential trade. But they also kept records of their own, unofficial and unrecognized, documenting the births they attended in journals hidden in trunks and beneath floorboards. Trask's investigation led him to 3 women who had served as midwives in the parish over the past 15 years. The first 2 refused to speak with him. But the third, a free woman of color named Celestine Bressard, agreed to meet him on condition of absolute anonymity. Their conversation took place in her small house on the edge of town, with the shutters drawn and the door barred. "I've attended more than 400 births in this parish," Celestine told him, her voice low and careful. "I know every woman of childbearing age, white and colored, free and enslaved. I know their cycles, their complications, their histories. But I've never once been called to the convent. Not in 15 years. Sister Evangeline says she and her fellow sisters handle all such matters themselves, that it's part of their ministry. Do you know what that tells me, Mr. Trask? It tells me she doesn't want witnesses." Celestine pulled out a ledger of her own, its pages filled with careful notations. "I keep track of all births in this parish, even the ones I don't attend. The slaves talk, you understand. Word spreads, and I've documented something curious. Women go to that convent, and 9 or 10 months later, babies appear on their home plantations. The mothers return, usually within a few months of giving birth, but the children stay on the estates. The official story is always that these women gave birth while still on their home plantations, and the babies were moved to the convent temporarily for the mother's spiritual rehabilitation. But the timing never quite works, Mr. Trask. The women are documented as being at the convent during the entire period. They would have been visibly pregnant." She showed him her records. Over 14 years, she had documented 43 births that didn't align properly with known timelines. 43 children whose origins were obscured by carefully maintained lies. Trask began his own documentation. He obtained, through means he never disclosed, copies of payment records from several estates that had done business with the convent. He interviewed former overseers who had worked on plantations that sent women for reformation. He spoke with merchants who delivered supplies to the convent, noting the quantities of food, cloth, and medical supplies that suggested a population larger than the 4 sisters who were supposedly the only residents. His most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: the convent's own legitimate expenses. To maintain her cover as a proper religious institution, Sister Evangeline had to make regular purchases from local merchants. These bills and receipts, mundane records of fabric purchases, food supplies, and medical necessities, revealed quantities that couldn't be explained by 4 nuns and a handful of women receiving spiritual instruction. The amount suggested a population of 25 to 30 people living on the property continuously. But documentation alone wasn't enough. Trask needed to see the operation firsthand, and that meant finding a way onto the grounds. He spent months planning his approach, knowing he would have only one opportunity. His chance came in February 1836, during a period of heavy rains that made the roads nearly impassable. Trask volunteered to deliver supplies to the isolated convent as an act of charity, loading his wagon with goods Sister Evangeline had ordered from various merchants. He arrived at dusk, the worst possible time to be traveling, which gave him a plausible excuse for requesting shelter for the night. Sister Evangeline met him on the gallery, her expression neutral but her eyes calculating. She accepted the delivered supplies but declined his request to stay, citing the convent's strict rules about male visitors. Trask persisted, pointing out the dangerous conditions of the road in darkness. Finally, reluctantly, she agreed he could shelter in one of the outbuildings until dawn. The outbuilding she indicated was a simple structure used for storing tools and equipment. Trask settled in, making a show of preparing to sleep. Then, Once he heard Sister Evangeline's footsteps retreat across the muddy yard, he waited. Night fell fully, and in the darkness, he began to hear things that confirmed every suspicion he had harbored. Voices, multiple voices coming from the main house. The creak of a trap door opening, footsteps descending into what must have been a cellar, a woman's cry, quickly muffled, the low murmur of male voices, at least two, maybe three. The sounds continued for hours, not loud enough to distinguish words, but present, undeniable, speaking to activities that no religious institution should harbor. Just before dawn, Trask heard a door open in the main house. He risked a glance through a gap in the outbuilding's wall. Two men emerged, their faces shadowed by their hats, their clothing marking them as men of wealth. They moved quickly to a carriage that had been sheltered behind the main house, out of sight from the road. The carriage bore no identifying marks or family crests. Within minutes, it had disappeared down the muddy track toward town. Trask returned to St. Augustine Parish that morning with enough evidence to pursue his story further, but not enough to publish. He needed more testimony from someone who had been inside the operation, documentation that couldn't be dismissed as circumstantial. He needed what every reporter needs: a witness willing to speak. That witness arrived in an unexpected form in the spring of 1836. Her name was Rachel, and she had been at the convent for nearly 4 years. She had entered as a rebellious 17-year-old girl taken from the Beaumont estate. She left as a woman who had given birth 3 times and buried 1 child in the unmarked section of the convent's grounds where infants who didn't survive were laid to rest without ceremony or recognition. Rachel didn't escape. Sister Evangeline's system was too carefully controlled for that. Instead, Rachel was returned to the Beaumont estate after what Sister Evangeline had determined was her final productive period. She was 21 years old, looked 40, and carried within her a rage that had been building for 4 years. She also carried something else: information. During her time at the convent, Rachel had been one of the women Sister Evangeline occasionally used for household tasks, which meant she had access to areas other women didn't. She had seen the ledgers, couldn't read them, but had memorized some of the patterns and numbers. She had overheard conversations between Sister Evangeline and her visitors. She knew names, dates, and details that existed nowhere else except in Sister Evangeline's locked records. Trask learned of Rachel's return through his network of sources in the enslaved community. Making contact required patience and careful planning. He couldn't simply approach her. Any interaction between a white newspaper editor and an enslaved woman would draw immediate suspicion. Instead, he worked through intermediaries, free people of color who could move between worlds with less scrutiny. The meeting finally occurred in June 1836, in a tobacco barn on the edge of the Beaumont property, at a time when Rachel was supposedly gathering eggs from the chickens that roosted there. Trask asked his questions, and Rachel answered in a voice that was flat, empty of emotion, as if she had burned through all her feeling and only facts remained. She described the cellar rooms in detail: their size, their furnishings, the bars on the doors. She explained Sister Evangeline's selection process, which women were chosen for which visitors based on physical characteristics, and what Sister Evangeline believed would produce the most valuable offspring. She revealed that Sister Evangeline kept a separate set of records hidden in a locked box in her sleeping chamber that detailed the true accounting of her operation. She keeps 2 books, Rachel explained, one for the church people to see if they ever ask, which shows the convent as a place of prayer and work. The other shows the truth: every man who visited, every payment made, every child born, every child sold. She told us once that the second book was her protection, that if anyone ever moved against her, she would reveal every name in it, and the scandal would destroy half the parish. She called it her insurance. Rachel also provided something more valuable than details. She provided dates and names of upcoming arrangements. Sister Evangeline's operation ran on a predictable schedule, with certain wealthy visitors coming at regular intervals. Within the next month, Rachel knew at least 3 such visits were planned. Trask faced a decision. He could publish what he knew now, relying on Rachel's testimony and his circumstantial evidence, likely resulting in denials and his own expulsion from the parish. Or he could wait, gather more evidence, and build a case so overwhelming that even the powerful men protecting Sister Evangeline couldn't dismiss it. He chose to wait, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. During the summer of 1836, Trask continued his investigation, but quietly now, careful not to alert anyone to his interest in the convent. He documented the arrivals and departures of unmarked carriages on the road to the convent property. He obtained, through a clerk who owed him a favor, copies of financial records showing unusual transfers of money from several prominent estates to accounts held in Sister Evangeline's name in New Orleans. He also discovered something that added another dimension to the horror. Sister Evangeline wasn't working alone, and she wasn't the originator of this system. Letters surfaced, purchased from a former postal clerk, suggesting that Sister Evangeline had been part of a similar operation in Haiti before the revolution there. She had fled the island in 1804 along with thousands of other French colonists and had eventually made her way to Louisiana. The Sisters of Divine Mercy had never existed as a recognized religious order. Sister Evangeline had created it from nothing, inventing her credentials and her mission to establish what she had learned in Haiti, that the most profitable operation in the slave economy wasn't working enslaved people in fields, but breeding them under controlled conditions for the market. The other three sisters at the convent weren't nuns at all, but women Sister Evangeline had recruited, possibly coerced into her operation. Sister Marie turned out to be her daughter. Sister Constance had been an enslaved woman herself before some arrangement gave her freedom in exchange for her service. Sister Beatrice remained a mystery, but documents suggested she had medical training, making her invaluable for handling the births and complications that inevitably arose. By September 1836, Trask had compiled a substantial file of evidence. He was preparing to publish a series of articles that would expose the convent's operation and name the men who had patronized it. He wrote to contacts in New Orleans and Boston, arranging for his findings to be published simultaneously in multiple newspapers, preventing any single power structure from suppressing the story. He never got the chance to publish. Just when everything seemed ready, when the truth about the convent in St. Augustine Parish was finally about to emerge into the light, the story took a turn that even Trask, with all his careful investigation, hadn't anticipated. If the revelations so far have shocked you, if you're invested in seeing justice done, then I need you to share this video with someone else who needs to hear this story. Hit that like button to help others find this truth and subscribe so you never miss the conclusions to mysteries like this one. Because what happened next changed everything, and the horror in St. Augustine Parish intensified in ways no one expected. Let's discover together what happens next. On the night of October 3, 1836, fire consumed the Sisters of Divine Mercy convent. The blaze started sometime after midnight, and by the time farmers in the neighboring properties saw the glow against the sky and rode to investigate, the main building was fully engulfed. The wooden structure, raised on those brick piers that should have protected it from flooding, instead created a chimney effect that fed the flames. Within 2 hours the building had collapsed into its own cellar. The first to arrive was Thomas Garrett, whose property bordered the convent land to the east. He later testified to parish authorities that when he reached the scene, the heat was so intense he couldn't approach within 50 yards of the main building. But even at that distance, even through the roar of the flames, he heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: screaming. Not the screams of 4 women, as the official count would later claim, but many voices, overlapping, desperate, coming from beneath the burning structure. Garrett attempted to organize a rescue effort as other neighbors arrived, but the fire had progressed too far. The outbuildings were also ablaze, and the intensity of the heat suggested multiple ignition points. By the time a bucket brigade could be organized using water from the property's well, the main structure had already begun its collapse. The screaming stopped before the building fell. Whether from smoke inhalation or the fire itself, no one could say. What Garrett didn't mention in his official testimony, but confided to his wife in a conversation she recorded in her diary, was something else he witnessed before the neighbors arrived, while he was still alone at the scene. He saw a figure on horseback emerge from behind the barn, moving quickly toward the road. The rider wore a long coat despite the warm October night, and his horse was one of the fine-blooded animals that only wealthy men could afford. The rider saw Garrett, hesitated for just a moment, then spurred his horse into a gallop and disappeared down the road toward St. Augustine Parish. Garrett never reported this sighting to authorities. "I knew what I had seen." His wife's diary recorded him saying, "And I knew that speaking of it would bring nothing but trouble to my family. The man on that horse was someone of importance. The way he fled told me everything I needed to know about who was responsible and who would be protected." The fire burned throughout the night. By dawn, when Father Russo arrived with several parish officials, all that remained of the Sisters of Divine Mercy convent were smoking ruins, collapsed timbers, and the brick piers standing like grave markers among the ash. The cellar, which should have provided some protection from the fire above, had become a crematorium. The wooden floor of the main level had collapsed into it, bringing burning timbers and debris that transformed the underground rooms into an oven. The official investigation began immediately, led by Sheriff Edmund Fairfax, one of the men whose initials appeared in Sister Evangeline's ledgers. Fairfax examined the ruins for 2 days, interviewed the neighbors who had witnessed the fire, and compiled his report with remarkable speed. His conclusion: accidental fire likely started by an overturned lamp in Sister Evangeline's chamber. Tragic loss of 4 devoted religious women who had given their lives in service to the unfortunate. But there were witnesses who saw things that didn't make it into Fairfax's report. An enslaved man named Jupiter, who worked on a neighboring plantation and had been tasked with night watch in the tobacco barn, reported to his overseer that he had seen lights moving around the convent property for hours before the fire started. Not the steady glow of lamps in windows, but moving lights, like torches being carried from building to building. His overseer documented this in his private journal but never reported it to authorities. What would be the point? The overseer wrote. Jupiter's testimony would not be accepted in any court, and the men investigating this matter have no interest in truths that complicate their preferred narrative. The examination of the cellar, once the ruins had cooled enough to permit entry, revealed the extent of the horror. Benjamin Trask, posing as a church official documenting the tragedy for the diocese, gained access to the site on October 7, 4 days after the fire. What he found there was recorded in his journal in entries that grew increasingly disturbed and fragmented as he processed what he was seeing. The cellar had been divided into 5 separate rooms, just as Rachel had described. Each room was approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, with heavy wooden doors that were now charred but still partially intact. Every door showed evidence of having been barred from the outside. The metal brackets that held the bars were still in place, bent by heat, but unmistakable in their purpose. Inside these rooms, Trask found remains. He couldn't count them precisely in the condition they were in, but he estimated at least 15 individuals, possibly more. The remains were clustered near the doors and against the walls, positions suggesting people had tried desperately to escape as the fire raged above them, and then collapsed into their prison. In one room, Trask found something that nearly broke him: the remains of what appeared to be 3 small children huddled together in a corner. The room also contained a simple cot, a wooden crate that might have served as a table, and the melted remnants of what might have been tin plates or cups. This had been someone's living quarters, someone with children, trapped underground while fire consumed the building above them. Trask's journal entry from that day reads, "I have seen war, I have seen poverty, I have seen the casual cruelty that men inflict upon each other daily in this slave society. But I have never seen anything that compares to this deliberate, calculated murder. These people were locked in, barred into rooms that became their tombs, left to die in darkness and terror, while the building burned above them. The doors were barred from the outside. This was not accident. This was execution." He attempted to report his findings to Father Russo, requesting a formal church investigation that would go beyond Sheriff Fairfax's cursory examination. The meeting occurred in the rectory of St. Dominic's Church on October 8. Trask presented his observations, his documentation of the barred doors, his count of the remains that far exceeded the official number. Father Russo listened, his face growing progressively more troubled, then more closed, then carefully neutral. "Mr. Trask," Father Russo finally said, "I understand your distress. This tragedy has affected us all. But you must understand that the Church's investigation has already concluded. The diocese has accepted Sheriff Fairfax's findings. 4 sisters died in an accidental fire. That is the official determination, and it will not be revisited." Trask pressed him, asking about the additional remains, the barred doors, the evidence of multiple ignition points. Father Russo's response was carefully worded, each sentence precisely chosen. "The condition of the ruins makes accurate assessment difficult. What you interpreted as additional remains may have been animal carcasses or other organic materials stored in the cellar. The doors may have been barred as a security measure common in isolated properties. And fires, Mr. Trask, behave unpredictably. What appears to be multiple starting points may simply be the pattern of a rapidly spreading blaze in a wooden structure." The subtext was clear. The official story would not change regardless of evidence, and anyone who persisted in questioning it would face consequences. Trask left that meeting understanding that he was alone in his pursuit of truth, and that truth itself had become dangerous. He made one final attempt to document the reality of what had occurred. He sought out Celestine Brussard, the midwife who had first provided him with evidence of the convent's true operation. He found her packing, preparing to leave the parish. She had been visited, she told him, by two men who suggested that her continued health depended on her forgetting everything she knew about the convent. "I have children, Mr. Trask," she said quietly. "I have grandchildren. I cannot help you anymore. I'm sorry, but I have to think of my family." She left that week for New Orleans, taking her records with her. Those records, which might have provided crucial evidence, disappeared with her and were never recovered. Years later, after her death in 1869, her children searched for the ledgers she had kept, hoping they might have historical value. They found nothing. Either Celestine had destroyed them herself, or someone else had ensured they would never surface. Rachel, Trask's primary witness, had already vanished. The official record showed her sale to a slave trader bound for Mississippi, but when Trask attempted to trace the transaction, he found inconsistencies. The trader listed on the Beaumont estate records denied ever purchasing anyone named Rachel. The sale price listed seemed unusually low for a healthy young woman, and most tellingly, no corresponding purchase record existed in any Mississippi estate registry that Trask could access. One possibility, whispered in the slave quarters but never proven, was that Rachel had been at the convent on the night of the fire, that she had been brought back there by Sister Evangeline, who had discovered Rachel's role as Trask's informant, that Rachel had died in the cellar with the others, and that her sale was simply a convenient explanation for her disappearance. The truth of what happened to Rachel remains one of the many unanswered questions surrounding the convent fire. The account ledgers, Sister Evangeline's detailed records of her operation, surfaced 3 weeks after the fire in a manner that created more questions than answers. They appeared on Father Russo's doorstep in a locked wooden box, delivered sometime during the night of October 24th. No one saw who left them. No note accompanied the box. The lock had to be forced open, revealing 2 sets of ledgers inside the innocuous records meant for potential inspection, and the detailed accounting of Sister Evangeline's true enterprise. Father Russo called an emergency meeting of parish leaders within hours of opening the box. Those present included Sheriff Fairfax, Judge Nathaniel Crane, Henry Beaumont, Charles Delmare, and 3 other prominent planters. The meeting lasted 4 hours. What was discussed remains unknown, but the outcome was clear. The ledgers had to be controlled. Judge Crane, whose initials appeared multiple times in the detailed accounting, took possession of the documents. His stated intention was to review them for the church's official records. What actually happened to those ledgers became the subject of speculation and rumor for decades. Some claimed they were destroyed immediately, burned to eliminate the evidence they contained. Others suggested they were hidden, kept as insurance by powerful men who wanted leverage over their peers. A third theory held that the ledgers were sent to the diocese in New Orleans, where they were locked in a vault and marked never to be opened. Whatever their ultimate fate, the ledgers disappeared from public knowledge. Only fragments survived, the single page discovered in 2003, and scattered references in private correspondence and journals kept by people who had briefly seen the documents before they vanished. These fragments were enough to confirm Rachel's testimony and Trask's suspicions, but not enough to provide a complete accounting of Sister Evangeline's operation, or the full list of men who had patronized it. The burial of the victims occurred on October 10, 1836, 1 week after the fire. Father Russo conducted the service at the convent property, attended by a handful of parish officials and curious neighbors. The mass grave was dug in the northwest corner of the property, away from the ruins of the buildings. No individual coffins were used. The remains were placed in the earth together, covered with lime and then soil, marked with a simple wooden cross and a stone marker that read, "Sisters of Divine Mercy and those under their care called home October 3, 1836. May perpetual light shine upon them." The service was brief. Father Russo read standard prayers for the dead, but made no mention of the specific individuals being buried, nor did he address any of the circumstances surrounding their deaths. The parish record of the burial listed 4 names: Sister Evangeline, Sister Marie, Sister Constance, and Sister Beatrice. Those under their care mentioned on the marker remained nameless in all official documentation. Thomas Garrett attended the burial service. He noted in a letter to a cousin that the grave seemed unusually large for 4 bodies, and that the amount of earth required to fill it suggested a much larger number of remains than officially acknowledged. But he also noted something else: the presence at the service of several wealthy planters who had no obvious connection to the convent's charitable mission, men who stood apart from the other mourners and who left immediately after the final prayers, not stopping to express condolences or discuss the tragedy with their neighbors. They came to ensure it was finished, Garrett wrote, to see with their own eyes that the evidence was buried, and the chapter closed. In the weeks following the burial, Trask made a final attempt to pursue his investigation. He traveled to New Orleans, hoping to find allies in the larger city, perhaps even officials who would be willing to look into the irregularities of the convent fire and its aftermath. He met with editors at 2 newspapers, presenting his documentation and his case for a formal investigation. Both editors listened, both expressed outrage at what he described, and both ultimately declined to pursue the story. The reason was consistent. The men implicated were too powerful, the evidence was too circumstantial after the destruction of key documents, and the political climate made it impossible to pursue a story that would scandalize the church and some of the state's most prominent citizens. One editor told Trask, "Frankly, even if everything you say is true, publishing it would accomplish nothing except your own destruction and possibly mine. These men have the power to silence newspapers, to ruin reputations, to make people disappear. I have a family, Mr. Trask. I cannot take this on." Trask returned to St. Augustine Parish in November 1836, defeated but not entirely broken. He continued publishing his newspaper through the end of the year, but his stories grew more careful, more circumspect, avoiding any subject that might draw unwanted attention. The break-in at his office occurred on December 17, 1836. Whoever entered knew exactly what they were looking for. Every document related to his convent investigation was taken, every note, every copy of records he had obtained, every piece of correspondence. His printing press was smashed, ostensibly by vandals, but the precision of the destruction suggested professionals. Nothing else of value was taken. The message was clear. On December 20, Trask received a visit from 3 men who introduced themselves as concerned citizens of the parish. They spoke politely, almost apologetically, but their meaning was unmistakable. His continued presence in St. Augustine Parish was no longer welcome. His newspaper had become a liability, both to himself and to the community's peace. They suggested strongly that he consider opportunities elsewhere. They mentioned, with seeming casualness, that unfortunate accidents had been known to happen to people who couldn't take good advice. Trask sold his newspaper in January 1837 to a buyer who renamed it and immediately shifted its editorial focus to agricultural news and social notices. He left Louisiana that same month, returning to Philadelphia and to work in his brother's printing business that demanded nothing more controversial than billheads and wedding invitations. He never practiced journalism again, but he kept his journal, and he continued making entries about the convent case whenever new information reached him. In 1842 he noted the death of Father Russo, who had passed quietly in his sleep after a series of strokes left him increasingly incapacitated. In 1851 he recorded the death of Sheriff Fairfax in a hunting accident that some whispered might not have been accidental at all. Fairfax had reportedly begun drinking heavily and talking too freely about matters best left buried. In 1859 he noted with bitter satisfaction that Charles Delmare had died bankrupt, his plantation seized for debts, his family scattered. Each death, each misfortune that befell the men involved in the convent's operation and its cover-up, Trask recorded with the comment, "One more debt unpaid." But he also acknowledged in entries that grew more philosophical as he aged that earthly justice for the convent's victims would never come. "The guilty will die in their beds," he wrote in 1863, "respected by their communities, mourned by their families, buried with honor in church cemeteries. The victims remain nameless in an unmarked mass grave on land now planted with cotton. This is the arithmetic of power. Those who have it escape consequence, and those who lack it suffer without remedy or recognition. The enslaved women who survived the convent system, those who weren't there on the night of the fire, carried their trauma in silence. Most never spoke of their experiences, even after emancipation in 1865 gave them legal freedom. The few who did tell their stories found little audience. Their testimonies were collected sporadically, often decades after the events, by researchers and social workers trying to document the full reality of slavery's horrors. One such testimony came from a woman named Dina, interviewed in 1879 as part of a philanthropic society's research into the conditions of formerly enslaved people. Dinah, who was 73 at the time of the interview, claimed to have spent 2 years at the Sisters of Divine Mercy convent. Her account provided details that matched what little was known about the operation, the cellar rooms, the nighttime visitors, Sister Evangeline's careful record-keeping, the births and separations of children from their mothers. "We knew what we was there for," Dinah told her interviewer. "Sister Evangeline, she told us plain the first day, we was there to be fruitful and multiply, and the fruit we bore would be sold for the glory of God and the profit of the righteous. She said it was God's will, that we were serving a higher purpose, but we knew it wasn't no different than what happened on any plantation, just fancied up with church talk and locked doors. The worst part wasn't what they did to our bodies. The worst part was taking our babies every time. Soon as they was born and she knew if they was going to live, they was taken. We never got to hold them more than a few hours. Never got to name them ourselves. Never got to keep a single one. Dinah's testimony, preserved in the archives of the Philanthropic Society, provided crucial corroboration of the convent's operation, but it appeared in a publication with limited circulation and drew little attention at the time. By 1879, the South was deep in the struggles of Reconstruction, and stories about slavery-specific horrors seemed to many like reopening wounds that needed to heal. Dinah's account was filed away with hundreds of other slave narratives, valuable to future historians but largely ignored by her contemporaries. The property where the convent stood changed hands multiple times in the decades following the fire. Each new owner farmed the land, growing cotton or sugarcane, depending on the market. The cellar ruins were filled in during the 1840s, covered over and planted. The mass grave remained, though the wooden cross rotted away and was never replaced. The stone marker lasted longer, but by the 1880s it had been broken, possibly deliberately, possibly by farm equipment. By 1900, no visible trace remained of the convent, the fire, or the people who had died there. Local memory proved more persistent than physical markers. Stories about the convent circulated in both white and black communities, though they took different forms. Among white residents, the story became simplified. There had been a convent, there had been a tragic fire. The sisters had died serving their charitable mission. Some versions added Gothic flourishes about strange lights or sounds on the property, transforming the real horror into ghost stories that obscured rather than illuminated the truth. In black communities, the stories were more specific and more terrible. Elderly people warned their daughters and granddaughters about what had happened there, using the convent as an example of how evil could hide behind religious respectability. Some versions claimed the fire had been set by the women themselves as an act of desperate rebellion, that they had chosen to burn rather than continue their exploitation. Other versions held that Sister Evangeline had set the fire to destroy evidence when she learned of Trask's investigation. A third narrative suggested that one of the wealthy patrons, fearing exposure, had destroyed the convent to protect himself and his peers. All three versions circulated, and possibly all three contained elements of truth. The children born at the convent faced fates that varied dramatically depending on their appearance, the circumstances of their birth, and the intentions of those who purchased or claimed them. Some were raised as enslaved workers on the plantations where they were placed, never knowing their true origins. Others, those with lighter complexions and European features, disappeared into white society through a process that was common in the antebellum South. They were raised as white children, their origins deliberately obscured, their connection to enslaved mothers erased. One fragmentary account suggests that at least 3 children from the convent were sent north before the Civil War, purchased by abolitionists who believed they were rescuing enslaved children, but who may not have fully understood the circumstances of their birth. These children were given new names, new identities, and were raised in free communities where their past was never discussed. Whether they ever learned their true origins remains unknown. The most heartbreaking cases were the children who died young, either at birth or in early childhood. Sister Evangeline's ledgers, before they disappeared, reportedly contained a separate section listing these deaths with the same clinical precision she applied to births and sales. The single surviving page from the ledgers includes 3 such entries at the bottom, noting infant deaths with causes listed as failure to thrive, fever, and misadventure. That last term, misadventure, applied to an infant death, suggests possibilities too dark to fully articulate. The full accounting of Sister Evangeline's operation will never be complete. Too many records were destroyed. Too many witnesses died without testimony. Too many powerful men successfully buried evidence that would have implicated them. But from the fragments that survived, a picture emerges of an operation that functioned for 17 years with remarkable efficiency, protected by institutional power and enabled by a system that treated human beings as property to be exploited in any manner that generated profit. Sister Evangeline herself remains an enigmatic figure. The few descriptions that survive paint her as intelligent, organized, utterly lacking in conventional empathy, and convinced of her own righteousness. She apparently believed that her operation was not only profitable but morally justifiable, that she was providing a service to men who needed it while simultaneously civilizing enslaved women through religious instruction. This capacity for moral inversion, to frame systematic exploitation as charitable mission, speaks to the profound corruption of values that slavery produced in those who defended and profited from it. The fire that ended her operation raises questions that can never be definitively answered. Was it an accident, as the official investigation claimed? Was it set by Sister Evangeline herself, choosing to destroy everything rather than face exposure? Was it set by one of her wealthy patrons, eliminating evidence and witnesses? Or was it, as some accounts suggest, an act of desperate resistance by the women imprisoned in the cellar, a choice to die by fire rather than continue their exploitation? The evidence is contradictory and incomplete. The multiple ignition points suggest deliberate arson. The barred cellar doors indicate someone intended for those inside to die. The presence of the mysterious horseman fleeing the scene suggests an external perpetrator. But Sister Evangeline's final ledger entry, with its talk of ending everything, suggests she may have been the architect of the destruction. Perhaps multiple parties were involved, Sister Evangeline setting fires to destroy evidence, a wealthy patron ensuring no witnesses survived, and circumstances spiraling beyond anyone's control into mass murder. What is certain is that justice, in any conventional sense, was never achieved. The guilty escaped punishment. The victims remained nameless and unmarked. The truth was suppressed with remarkable success, maintained through a combination of institutional power, social pressure, and the willing complicity of men who had too much to lose from its exposure. The Catholic Church's role in the convent's operation and the subsequent cover-up remains a point of historical controversy. Some historians argue that church leadership was genuinely deceived by Sister Evangeline's carefully constructed facade of piety. Others point to the speed with which the investigation was concluded and evidence suppressed as indication of deliberate complicity. The truth likely falls somewhere between. Local church officials like Father Russo may have been willfully blind, choosing not to look too closely at an operation that seemed to serve multiple purposes, while higher church authorities moved quickly to contain scandal once the full truth emerged. The diocese's official position, maintained to this day, is that the Sisters of Divine Mercy were exactly what they claimed to be: a small, earnest religious community that met a tragic end. Requests by researchers for access to diocesan archives related to the convent have been consistently denied, with officials citing privacy concerns and the need to protect the reputations of the innocent. This continued refusal to permit independent examination of whatever records still exist suggests that even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the full truth remains too dangerous or too embarrassing to acknowledge. Benjamin Trask lived until 1881, dying at the age of 73 in Philadelphia. His journal was preserved by his family, passed down through generations until a great-grandnephew donated it to a historical society in the 1920s. The journal sat largely unexamined in that archive for decades, catalogued but not studied, its significance not recognized until a graduate student in the 1980s began researching the slave breeding systems of the antebellum South and stumbled across Trask's meticulous documentation. That researcher, Dr. Helen Marchand, spent 15 years attempting to verify Trask's claims and reconstruct the full story of the Sisters of Divine Mercy convent. Her work was groundbreaking but incomplete. Many of the records Trask had copied were gone forever. The people he had interviewed were long dead. The physical site had been developed and redeveloped, erasing all traces of the original buildings. But Dr. Marchand was able to confirm enough details, matching names in Trask's journal to estate records, finding property transaction documents, locating descendants who possessed fragments of family stories, to establish that Trask's account was substantially accurate. Marchand's book, Breeding the Future: Sister Evangeline and the Hidden Economy of Slavery, was published in 1997 by an academic press and reached a limited audience. It created some controversy among Louisiana historians, particularly regarding its implications about the Catholic Church's role, but it was largely confined to scholarly circles. The general public remained mostly unaware of the convent's existence and what had occurred there. This obscurity persists. The property where the convent stood is now a residential subdivision, developed in the 1950s with no acknowledgement of what had occurred on that land. The families living on Mercy Lane and Chapel Road have no idea that their homes sit on ground where enslaved women were systematically exploited, and where at least 18 people died in a fire that was likely mass murder. No historical marker commemorates the site, no memorial acknowledges the victims. The mass grave, if it still exists intact beneath the development, holds its dead in permanent silence. In 2003, when that single page from Sister Evangeline's ledger surfaced in an archive in New Orleans, it created brief public interest. Local news stations ran stories about the breeding nun of Louisiana, focusing on the sensational aspects while largely avoiding the deeper questions about institutional complicity and the systematic nature of slavery's horrors. The attention faded within a few weeks, and the story returned to academic obscurity. For the descendants of those who suffered in the convent, the lack of recognition and memorial represents an ongoing injustice. Some descendants have worked to establish a marker at the site, but they face resistance from the homeowners association and property owners, who worry that acknowledging such a dark history would affect property values. This tension between historical truth and contemporary comfort, between honoring victims and maintaining pleasant neighborhoods, remains unresolved. The broader lessons of Sister Evange's operation extend beyond Louisiana or even beyond slavery itself. Her story demonstrates how easily evil can be institutionalized, how readily it can be disguised as virtue, and how effectively it can be protected by those with power and privilege. It shows how victims can be silenced, evidence can be destroyed, and truth can be suppressed, not through vast conspiracy, but through the simple alignment of interests among people who benefit from silence. It also demonstrates the particular cruelties that systems of oppression inflict on women, whose bodies become commodities, whose children are stolen, whose suffering is dismissed or denied. The women of Sister Evangeline's convent were victimized 3 times over: first, by the system of slavery that stripped them of freedom and turned them into property; second, by Sister Evangeline's own exploitation of their bodies and reproductive power; and finally, by history itself, which erased their names and left their suffering unacknowledged even in death. The question is not only how such an operation could exist for 17 years, but why it was allowed to. How could it have been protected by both church and state? How could its exposure have been so completely buried? And how could an atrocity of this scale simply vanish from collective memory? The truth is unsettling. What happened within the Sisters of Divine Mercy convent was not an isolated act of evil. It was a concentrated reflection of attitudes that shaped the entire antebellum world. It reveals how the machinery of slavery extended far beyond the cotton fields into the pulpits, the hospitals, the schools, and even the sacred spaces that claimed to represent salvation. Sister Evangeline's operation thrived because it served the interests of powerful men, it generated profit, and it was protected by institutions more concerned with preserving their own sanctity than seeking justice for the violated and the lost. The ease with which she twisted the language of mercy, charity, and purity into tools of exploitation exposes the moral rot at the heart of that society. It reminds us that evil often hides behind virtue's mask and that silence is its most faithful accomplice. So, what do you think? Was everything truly revealed? Or are there still secrets buried beneath the soil on what is now Mercy Lane, bones beneath the manicured lawns, stories that never found a voice? How many other places like this existed, protected by the same conspiracy of silence? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, dark histories that peel back the polished surface of America's past, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who believes the truth should never stay buried. Because the past is never really past. It lingers beneath our feet, waiting to be uncovered, still demanding to be heard, still asking why those who suffered are forgotten while those who profited are remembered with monuments and praise. See you in the next one.